Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Adam White. I direct the C. Boyd and Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. And it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all this morning to a series of conversations, centered around the theme of bureaucracy and presidential administration. Now, in the program, you'll find a quote from Alexander Hamilton that we thought set the right tone for today's conversations. In the Federalist, Hamilton observed that the true test of good government is its aptitude and tendency to produce a good administration. And you can read this in two ways. You can read it as an observation of history and also a challenge for future generations. The challenge of finding the balance of energy and stability, the balance of expertise and accountability. And of course, that's a challenge that America has grappled with ever since, from the first administration onward. We grapple with it still today. And so we thought we would organize a conference centered around some of these themes, looking back at the origins of federal bureaucracy, the relationship between the presidency and civil service, and continuing through to today with more practical conversations on the ways in which public power is administered in our own time. As with all of these conferences, each panel centers around one or more papers that were workshopped previously at the Gray Center. You can now find all of those papers available on our website in our working paper series, and the authors will go on to publish them in law reviews and political science journals and elsewhere. And we hope that today's discussions help to inform the authors as they move forward with their papers. So let's just jump right into the first conversation. Our first panel is titled Bureaucracy, the Presidency, and the Origins of Federal Civil Service. This conversation centers around a new paper by Joseph Postel, and the discussion is moderated by our friend Melanie Marlowe. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Security. She's a lecturer at Georgetown. She's a scholar of the presidency, and her work includes, among other things, the recent edited volume, The Obama Presidency and the Constitutional Order. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and thanks, Melanie, for leading this conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with Brian Cook, Emeritus Professor at Virginia Tech, Joe Postel from University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and my old friend Andy Bush from Claremont McKenna College. Joe's paper is From Merit to Expertise and Back, the Evolution of the U.S. Civil Service System. And he notes in the beginning of his paper that there's been a lot of attention and focus on the removal power that the president has, but there hasn't been a lot of attention given to the appointment of the civil service. So this was a very instructive paper for me to read. So Joe, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Adam, and thanks to the Gray Center for the opportunity to be here. As Melanie mentioned, my paper tries to give a sort of broad historical sweep of the evolution of the civil service system in America. And by civil service, I mean something broad, not just what starts in the Pendleton Act in 1883, but really how civil service or how staffing the administration is thought of throughout American history. For kind of presenting it in a brief summary, like on a panel like this, I thought it might be useful to refer to what historians of political parties have developed, a framework for talking about different party systems. So if you've studied political parties, you may know scholars on political parties say there are these different party systems that occur throughout American history: the Federalist era, the Jacksonian period, the New Deal era, and so forth. In the same vein, I think you could say my paper argues that there are 5 different civil service systems that have existed in American history. And so what I'll do very briefly is just kind of give a sense of what each civil service system represented, what its basic principle was, and what were the strengths and the disadvantages of each. Most people think that the American civil service system essentially starts with the Pendleton Act in 1883. Most of the scholarly treatments say that's the beginning of the American civil service system. And so they present a sort of binary history in which you have patronage before Pendleton, and then once Pendleton arrives, the Pendleton Act arrives, you have essentially the merit system or the civil service system we have today. I think the story is much more complex than that. And that's why I think dividing it into 5 periods or systems makes sense. And I think this is important because it shows that the alternatives we face in looking at the civil service are much broader than simply, do you want a patronage system or do you want an expert bureaucracy. I think there are actually more alternatives than that, and this history, I think, is useful for illustrating those alternatives. So the first system that the paper covers is the Federalist era system, which defines merit as fitness of character. This was a phrase used by President Washington to describe his primary criterion for who he thought should be appointed to the administration. He looked for integrity, fitness of character, even signals like sort of family connections and things like that. So fitness of character was sort of the chief principle of the Federalist civil service system, with one important addition, and that is that Washington emphasized the importance of geographic representation. So he wanted the civil service to actually be geographically representative of the entire country. And this was an important principle to him for establishing the legitimacy of the administration, that if it was drawn from just one part of the country, it wouldn't really be taken as legitimate by the people. So he balanced his appointments to the administration from all sections of the country. And it wasn't just Washington. His successors followed this example. Thomas Jefferson wrote to Henry Knox in 1801, quote, "In our country, talents alone are not to be the determining circumstance, but a geographical equilibrium is to a certain degree expected," end of quote. So politics played a role in appointments, but a politics based on geographic representation, that the bureaucracy or the administration should be representative of the country as a whole. The last defining feature of the Federalist civil service system was permanence in office. So we don't normally think of permanence in office as something existing prior to the Pendleton Act, but as a matter of practice, it was understood that lower level officials such as clerks, surveyors, customs collectors, and so forth should retain their jobs even with the arrival of a new administration. So there was something like permanence in office even during the Federalist period. And the advantages of this system are that it gave the government stability, it gave the government experience, and it gave the government legitimacy in a period where it was not entirely grounded. The downside, of course, is that permanence in office led to the idea in some circles of a property right in a government job. This was actually an idea that starts to emerge at the end of the Federalist era. It even extended in some cases to inheritance. So sometimes customs collectors would be succeeded by their sons as if they had handed down a property right in their job to their posterity. John Calhoun writes a letter warning President James Monroe, about, quote, "the tendency to hereditary principle in the inferior offices of our country," end of quote. So this was a sort of patrician civil service system in the Federalist period. The second system that succeeds it is well known and probably does not need a tremendous amount of elaboration. This is brought about by the Jacksonian Revolution in the 1820s, which brings about the patronage system as a pillar of democratic or republican theory. President Andrew Jackson famously announced his views on civil service reform, so to speak, calling rotation in office a leading principle in the Republican creed. That offices should be rotated frequently, new blood should be brought into the administration, so to speak. And so instead of permanence in lower level jobs, new administrations would remove officers en masse and replace them with their own loyal supporters. This is the patronage or the spoils system that we have come to know. Jackson was not particularly worried about the fact that this may deprive the government of experience. As he put it, quote, "the duties of all public officers are so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance," end of quote. So anyone could do the job of an administrative officer. We didn't need to worry about long tenure in office or permanence or expertise. And now we tend to dismiss the value of the spoils system, focusing on its corruption, but it did carry some benefits. The most significant benefit was that it connected the government to the people in a way that enhanced administrative legitimacy. Leonard White, a distinguished historian of administration, writes, quote, "there is value in the sense of union between common folk on the one hand and their public officers on the other," end of quote. So there's a value in having some sort of unity between the administration and the people, and patronage accomplished that union. Patronage gave people of all classes a path to public service. Citizens saw a government that resembled them. And this sense of union arguably is absent today. People don't think that the administration resembles them. Now, of course, the corruption of this second civil service system can't be overlooked as the primary downside. Just to illustrate this corruption, you're all familiar with it. One wanted ad in a Washington newspaper during this period offered $100 cash and 10% of 1 year's salary for a position in any of the departments. So people take out wanted ads trying to get jobs, offering rewards for people who got them jobs in the administration. And solicitations for office preoccupied presidents and members of Congress incessantly. So politicians were doing more work getting people jobs than they were on the business of the country. The third system, civil service system, came from a reaction against the excesses of patronage, and it culminated in the Pendleton Act of 1883. Now, we normally associate the Pendleton Act with the rise of the modern civil service system, but its main goal was really the restoration of the Federalist conception of merit. The story of the Pendleton Act's passage is a lengthy story. It's complicated. So I'll just highlight one or 2 points here. First, the debates in Congress over the Pendleton Act are devoid of any reference to, or devoid of significant references to, the need for expert bureaucrats. The object that most of the reformers were aiming at in the Pendleton Act was moral restoration. They did not like the moral excesses of the patronage system. For instance, and a few points sort of indicate this. For instance, Congress does not place any limits on the president's removal power in the Pendleton Act. And presumably it would have done that if it was seeking to establish some sort of expert bureaucracy in that law. Most significantly, and this is a little-known fact, the Pendleton Act initially covers 11% of the federal workforce, placing only 11% of the workforce in the civil service system. However, an important provision in the bill allowed future presidents to extend the protections of the civil service by executive order. The effect of this provision is easy to predict. Right? Presidents after the Pendleton Act would put their own people in office, then extend the umbrella of civil service protection over them so that future presidents could not use those positions for patronage. So the extension of civil service was not necessarily something Pendleton envisioned, but it was built into the law because it incentivized future presidents to expand civil service protection. So it was politics really more than it was theory that explains what's going on in the extension of the merit system after Pendleton. Okay. The fourth civil service system, it's the progressive period, which I call the fourth civil service system, where you really get the emphasis on technocratic expertise. And it was the progressive theorists and progressive presidents who really pushed the idea of neutral technocratic expertise. Most famously, many of you are probably familiar with this, in an famous article titled "The Study of Administration," Woodrow Wilson wrote about civil service reform in part, and he said that it was, quote, "but a prelude to fuller administrative reform," end quote. That civil service was a prelude to a larger administrative reform that he envisioned in the early 20th century. That fuller administrative reform that Wilson envisioned ultimately became known as the politics-administration distinction, this famous distinction in public administration theory. Wilson probably stated this dichotomy between politics and administration most famously, saying, quote, "Administration lies outside the proper sphere of politics. Administrative questions are not political questions," end of quote. So politics and administration would be separated in this vision, and this would create the opportunity for rule by enlightened expertise. You got a sort of development of neutral competence and technocratic expertise during the Progressive era. The extension of the civil service system occurs rapidly during this period. And then also, of course, the creation of independent regulatory commissions, which are designed to remove these people from politics. What I find interesting about this is we often conclude the history there. We often say, okay, the Progressive era gives us the politics administration distinction. We get expert administration, and that's where we are now. I think that's not actually an accurate depiction of the history. And so the last civil service system that I think emerges is what we have today. And it's really a reaction that occurs almost immediately after the Progressive era. By the time of the New Deal, public administration scholars and politicians have essentially rejected the politics administration distinction. And they emphasize a different principle, and that is presidential management. executive management of the bureaucracy. The most famous expression of this principle is the Brownlow Committee, FDR's Committee on Administrative Management, which famously called the bureaucracy a, quote, headless fourth branch of government, end of quote. That the idea during the New Deal was we needed to create tools for the presidency to manage the bureaucracy rather than insulate the bureaucracy from politics. And this is really an important revolution in the idea behind civil service reform. Some political reforms occurred during the New Deal and afterwards to give the president more management tools. I think we'll hear more about this as the day goes on. So I'll just briefly allude to some of them. This creation of Schedule C in the 1950s, the expansion of personnel management tools in the White House, and the creation of the Senior Executive Service in the 1970s reforms all stemmed from a renewed emphasis on presidential management rather than the separation of politics and administration. So really, I think we have a variety of different principles that have emerged at different periods of time. Fitness of character, patronage as a democratic or republican principle, moral restoration in the bureaucracy, presidential management expertise. And I think that understanding the history of civil service more broadly in this sense tells us a couple of things that I'll conclude by just briefly mentioning. First, it tells us that the history of civil service doesn't give us a simple answer to what needs to be done today. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of these principles, and in some ways they all need to be balanced against each other. The extremes of these principles have in some ways caused problems in different periods of American history. The other thing I think it indicates is that civil service reforms need to be considered from a constitutional point of view. Each of the civil service systems we've had throughout our history was based on a specific understanding of administration's role in the Constitution. And so the question of bureaucracy, civil service reform, presidential administration is really fundamentally tied to, and always has been tied to, what is the role of administration in the Constitution and where does it fit? And that's the fundamental starting point for all of the reflections about these kinds of questions. Thanks.
Brian.
Thank you, Joe. That was tremendous. And thank you also to Adam for the invitation and for the nameplates, because now I can remember who I am. This is an incredibly stimulating short paper. Joe covers a considerable ground in a short compass. And of course, by stimulating, I mean there's a lot of things I want to argue with him about. And for entertainment purposes, we might do that, but I'm not going to go down that road except for 2 points. And then I'll raise a more general point. One is I want to, and maybe we can discuss this, make sure we clarify that in Hamilton's thinking about a civil service, his notion of stability in the civil service didn't involve it eventually leading to a property right in the office. Those were political developments that, had Hamilton been alive rather than, shot in a duel, he might have found somewhat disturbing and tried to resist it. The other thing that I just want to point out as a historical nuance is that it's important, and I've been arguing this for 20 years, nobody listens to me, that the study of administration is not the only thing that Woodrow Wilson had to say about administration. And in fact, his whole conception of what has come to be called the public administration dichotomy was a legitimating argument for the growth of a major civil service system. It was not a prescription for how you design it or conceive of it. And in fact, as he said early on, administration and how it functions should be rooted in deep and stable principles, by which he meant just what Joe was talking about, that is constitutional and even pre-constitutional principles of the state and the regime. So it's a valuable, if you're interested in these kinds of things, it's valuable to see more of what Wilson had to say and what Wilson did with respect to the design of an administrative system. What I want to build on from Joe's paper, first of all, I want to acknowledge the really important insight he offers in terms of the framework, this idea of civil service systems. Because I think it's a very interesting and very constructive framework. I think there's a lot of nuance that we could explore within the interpretation of what those systems were. But what I find most fascinating is that Joe's paper raises, at least for me, the fundamental question of what constitutes merit. So in an exchange with everybody by email before we met today, I jotted down or suggested some questions that we could pose and perhaps talk about in terms of the fundamental question of what constitutes merit. So, is merit a useful, even critical value for organizing a civil service and guiding its function? We don't really stop and think very much about what merit means, or even whether it's the right concept to use for organizing a civil service system, at least in the American constitutional system. If it's not, what would be the alternatives to merit as a concept to guide the design of the civil service system? I think we're going to hear more about possibilities in the next panel. If it is a useful or even a critical value, again, what constitutes merit? Should it be defined simply as non-partisanship? Or should it be more expansive? A sort of flexible vessel into which we pour a number of component values that enable a liberal democratic regime to make maximum use of administrative power while minimizing its supposed dangers. And what combination of those component values is most defensible? So just to extend this a little bit, so let's take, for example, the last paragraph in Joe's paper, in which he talks about the need to balance principles that are always to some extent in tension. He notes that administration should be competent and administrators should be chosen by merit, but they also have to be responsive and accountable to the public. And I find this a fascinating way that we've framed things, because we think about merit as this thing, and then accountability as this other thing. But why can't merit include being accountable, understanding the need in the behavior of the individual administrator or of an administrative state, that's part of how they demonstrate their merit. That is, you evaluate individuals, even on intake, about what they have to say about their understanding about their position in the constitutional system and how they need to be responsive and accountable, and in what forms that would take. There's a great deal of literature on administrative ethics, which doesn't often get discussed in discussions about what constitutes merit. But don't we want administrators to be ethical? So why wouldn't we define merit as also some form or some conception of ethics? Either the autonomous ethical agent, which is the basic model of public administration ethics, or some other form of it. Finally, just so you know where I stand on these things, I have an entirely different notion of what constitutes merit, or what should be part of defining merit. And that involves thinking about what kinds of actions or what kinds of effects administration, as well as any other political institution, has in their operation. And as Joe knows, because he read this, I divide them between instrumental functions and effects and constitutive functions and effects. And this challenge of administrators and administration is, and here's the real tension I see, is between the instrumental, that is, they are charged with carrying out the law to achieve some purpose. And they're expected to perform in certain ways and in accord with certain standards to realize those purposes. But in fact, in the process of doing so, they actually shape how people behave. They shape relationships within society. They shape the relationship between clients and agencies, between recipients of aid and agencies, all of the kinds of things that those of you who may be familiar with the policy feedback literature talk about. And these are formative effects. And administrators have to navigate the tension between these, because for people who are the observers and also the rulers, if you will, they often see that while the administration is supposed to be doing one thing, that is achieving some purpose, they're also having effects that aren't necessarily directly associated with that purpose. They are shaping the way people think about themselves as political actors. Famous work by Susan Mettler about the GI Bill of Rights and its effect on the political behavior of veterans. So those kinds of things weren't an intention of the design of the GI Bill, but in fact, it shaped the political efficacy sense of veterans. So there's this tension that people feel, even if they're not completely conscious about it, between the constitutive and the instrumental. And it would be interesting to explore the possibility that we could find ways to develop the sensitivity of administrators that they are faced every day in everything they do with trying to navigate the tension between the instrumental and the constitutive. Anyway, to close, the main question I'm raising is, what's merit? How could we define it, or how should we define it, or should we throw it out and try some other conception of the standards and principles we would apply for selecting civil servants and observing their behavior and guiding them in their work, and agencies as well in their work.
Thank you. Great. Andy.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, Adam. And it's a beautiful hotel, wonderful location for this this event. I wanted to start by commending Joe on his paper, which I thought was very interesting. And it takes what in some ways is kind of a well-worn history and really takes a second and fresh look at it. I appreciated that. So I'm going to start by asking just a few questions about some specifics in the paper itself, some of the concepts in the paper, and then I want to finish, I guess, with some greater consideration of this theme of tensions, because I think that kind of runs throughout both the paper and the more general conversation. So, in terms of some specific questions, Joe brought up the issue of geographical representation as an early principle in the civil service. And one thing that wasn't entirely clear, and I don't know if Joe has if his research can speak to this or not, but the question occurred to me whether that geographical representation was seen by the earliest presidents as a kind of fixed principle, or whether it was considered more as a sort of temporary expedient at the moment of the nation's formation to try to help consolidate the national sense. So that was one thing one question that occurred to me. Another one was something that did not come up in Joe's remarks, but is in the paper, and that's reference to legislation 3 decades before the Pendleton Act, supported by the Whigs, creating a competitive exam system for clerks. And I thought that was particularly interesting, something I had not heard of before, and something which would seem, I guess, at least superficially, to confirm the notion that Joe is putting forward, that the issue initially in civil service was not expertise, because the thought occurred to me, if you're after expertise, the first place you're going to institute competitive exams is not going to be clerks, probably, maybe lighthouse operators, right? Or maybe even customs inspectors who have to know a lot, specific information. And yet, it seems to be the clerks where this went first. So that was curious to me. The third question has to do with also something in Joe's paper, but this was a statement from Congressman Jenks, right, a decade and a half before the Pendleton Act, where he lays out in a speech what is basically the standard case, as Joe put it, for civil service reform. And there are three parts to it, 3 points. One was that it would make government more efficient. One was that it would lead to a higher level of talent in government. And one was that it would give politicians more time to do important things. And the thought occurred to me, was there a fourth underlying point that maybe does not come out in public speeches all that much, but which would seem to me to be likely to be on the minds of public officials, elected officials, and that is, if you're a politician, you like to be liked, right? And you want your ratio of people who like you to people who don't like you to be positive. If there are 5 people who want every job, you're going to make one person very, very happy and 4 people unhappy, and that's not the ratio that you're looking for. And I'm wondering if any notion of that comes across, probably not in speeches on the floor of the House, but is there any sense in here that the elected officials are starting to feel like this is a losing game, and we kind of like to move on from it. As far as the tensions go, there's the tension that was mentioned at the end of the paper, raised in the New Deal, and I want to come back to that, but there's one that was raised much earlier in the paper, very briefly, and that was a kind of tension between the president and Congress, right? That the Whigs objected to the spoil system partly because they saw it as a means of ripping away certain influence over the bureaucracy from Congress and giving it to the president. And I'm wondering, if more couldn't have been said about the role of Congress after the end of the spoil system. How do they try to kind of re-interject themselves into this process? Certainly today, if you're an agency head, you're very well aware of Congress, right? You don't act in absence of that because, among other things, they can haul you before a committee and grill you on C-SPAN for 12 hours. And so Congress is not a non-entity in all of this, but what kind of role did Congress fashion for itself once the spoil system went down? Second tension that Joe mentions, or at least contrast that he mentions, is between merit and the concept of neutral competence. He points out that the progressives did not see these as the same. They saw neutral competence perhaps as growing out of this question of merit in some way, but as being distinct from it. And yet today, in many instances, we have a kind of tendency to conflate the two, right? And I guess my question would be here, if there is a kind of tension, or at least a difference between merit and neutral competence, and if it wasn't the progressives who conflated the two of them, when and where and by whom did they get conflated? What was that process, and what does that tell us about civil service, if anything? And then we had this final tension that was raised from Franklin Roosevelt on, this ascendant hope or desire for presidential management colliding in some sense with the progressive notion of expert administration. And I'm wondering if it's not, maybe the way to formulate this is not so much that FDR wanted to push back against expert administration in favor of presidential management because he didn't like expert administration, but because he really did like expert administration, right? But rather, perhaps he wanted to promote expert administration as long as it was subject to presidential control. But the classic statement that comes to mind is when Roosevelt proclaimed that the day of enlightened administration has come. And for a long time, I had read that as a kind of synonym for expert administration, but in fact, clearly it's not, right? But I also don't think that it's that expert administration is absent from that notion. So perhaps for Roosevelt, enlightened administration meant expert administration that was politically reliable, right? Or something along those lines in a broad sense. And I guess a question that grows from that would be, though perhaps not, Roosevelt's intention, do we have a third kind of model that has developed in the meantime, which is to say, not entirely presidential management and not entirely neutral expert administration, but in some sense a kind of politicized expert administration. And we don't always see this because what the president wants and where the expert administration is going are often in sync. But I think there are moments when that's clearly not the case. I think we're sort of in one of those moments right now. And that kind of exposes this rift and perhaps raises the question of whether we don't have a sort of politicized expert administration. And I raise a few examples of this. Take, for example, some of the resistance inside the Interior Department to land management policies in the 1980s, right? Or the EPA in the 1980s, or the EPA today. And lest anyone think that this is a purely partisan sort of tendency, a lot of resistance within HHS to welfare reform in 1986. And this could be a combination of philosophical inclination, a certain amount of bureaucratic self-interest, but there does seem to be a kind of asymmetric application of this politicized expert administration, by which I mean I have not yet seen, maybe there will be, maybe there's one that I'm not aware of, but we have not yet, to my knowledge, seen the EPA go rogue because some of the permanent members of the bureaucracy have fears that it's instituting too much regulation that might drag the economy too much. You didn't really see resistance within HHS to implementation of the Affordable Care Act, right? And so there does seem to be kind of asymmetric quality to this. But I will kind of leave that out there as a question, whether there is a model of a kind of independent but not entirely neutral expert administration.
Great, okay. Joe?
Sure, yeah, and I won't, there's a lot to respond to, and I won't respond to everything.
Sure, we can have some of it in the discussion.
Maybe just to point out that this conversation, I think, is raising a couple of interesting historical moments that I didn't really have the time to talk about, that aren't even maybe as fully fleshed out in the paper as they need to be, that might be worth more attention. The first is the Whig Party's view of administration. There's a lot of interesting things to connect there, not just with civil service reform, but with the sort of Whig philosophy of government in general, right? The opposition to Jackson telling the Treasury Secretary how to use his discretion. That the Whigs thought that presidents shouldn't be able to direct their subordinates that way, that executive officials should be accountable to the law and not to the president. But then also their views on sort of staffing the administration, I think, are sort of hard for us to grapple with, right? That they are the first to set up competitive examinations. It's not the Pendleton Act in 1883. It's actually the Whig Party that starts to set up competitive examinations for certain clerks. Now, again, maybe it's the nature of the position that enables them to do that. So something about, what is the Whig theory of administration? If the Whigs had actually won very many elections during the time that they were in existence, of course they didn't, but had they won a lot of elections and had the chance to define their period, how would it have differed from the Jacksonian patronage approach? I think is maybe something worth pondering. In other words, what's a legislative-centered civil service? What does that look like? What are the dynamics that are involved there? And then the other is sort of the other historical moment that maybe needs to be thought of here is the 1912 election and the fight amongst the progressives themselves over what's the relationship between the president and the bureaucracy. So the Theodore Roosevelt New Nationalism approach to running the administration versus the Woodrow Wilson New Freedom approach is when Andy talks about sort of politicized expert administration, presidential management combined with technocratic expertise. I get the sense that that's what the New Nationalism is trying to accomplish, putting the president in charge of the bureaucracy, but also having a bureaucracy that's expert at the same time. The difficulty there is, while you can state that at the level of generality, the president manages the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy is filled with experts, how you actually operationalize that is something that's very hard to understand, for me at least. And so I'd be interested in thinking about what does it mean to combine the principles of presidential management on the one hand with expert administration on the other, because they seem, at least at the level of theory, to be in some conflict. So there's more to say, but I think those two things are jumping out for me as important things to consider.
Okay. Could we go back to the discussion of merit? And do you have anything you would like to add on some of that? I mean, that's expansive. We can't probably come to a consensus on what it should be right now, but what would you say to Brian's remarks?
I think the idea of fitness of character as part of merit is something we've largely abandoned today. We see fitness of character as a sort of prerequisite, but not a component of merit. In other words, if you're corrupt, you shouldn't be in the administration. But we don't think that good character is something we should think about when we're evaluating who to appoint to an administrative position. And so,
what would you consider a good character?
That's probably why we've abandoned it, is because for Washington and for people during the Federalist era, it was they come from a good family. It turns out that the administration was essentially staffed by the same families for an entire generation, because those were the people we could trust. Those were the people who had good character. And there's something offensive about that, rightfully, that you would just have a sort of patrician administration. On the other hand, it seems important to have good character in administration. And so fitness of character, I think, should be an important part of it, of what we define merit as. But it does raise the challenge of how you're going to define that, how you're going to screen people for good character. I think we do background checks, but that's not really what Washington and the Federalists.
Some more exposed if you have really bad character.
I mean, it would probably be impractical, but the process by which presidential management fellows are selected is essentially a much more capacious form of evaluating merit that includes those kinds of things. And it's a very intense, I'm not sure if there's both a written and an oral exam, but there's a kind of a case-based challenge and a whole bunch of other stuff. And maybe you couldn't do that for, a civil service of 2 million people, and maybe you wouldn't need to. But there's no reason why we couldn't reconceive what we use as the filters by which we select individuals into the civil service that would include some new version of fitness of character that wasn't related to who your family was, but what you've demonstrated or can demonstrate in terms of your ethical tendencies or other sorts of things like that. So I agree that it was abandoned because of this reaction to the aristocratic sort of roots to it, but that's the whole point of doing history, which is, here's something we might want to recover and fashion it for our current way of thinking about this problem, right? So let's not completely ignore it as a possibility as we sift through, the construction of a new version of a civil service system, if that's what we're interested in doing.
Okay, Andy, do you have anything that you'd like to add before we toss it to the audience?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I have one question, but I'm going to hold it until the end. Okay,
I do have something to say about the Whigs,
Oh,
but
would you like to say it now?
no.
Okay. Come on, say it now.
Well, the Whig concept of administration was that there were pools of discretion. That it wasn't a hierarchical structure. That's why they were so resistant to the Jacksonian approach, because they saw what was happening. And of course, that is related to the fact that they controlled Congress much more than they controlled the presidency. But a version of what might have been a Whig-dominated conception of the civil service is probably what you would see if are you familiar with David Rosenblum's book, A Congress-Centered Public Administration, or a Legislative-Centered Public Administration? Congress has constructed a pretty elaborate structure for controlling public administration, controlling the civil service in ways that are it's not a counter to what to presidential management. It's a supplement or I don't know how to characterize it, but they have lots of ways of doing it, and probably the Whigs would have had some version. At least that's my wild guess about how the Whigs would operate.
All right, questions? Yeah.
Stuart Reuter. Talking about your geographic representation sounded like bringing people in from the far reaches to Washington, but there has been a move in the other direction, call it a reversal. The first one I know of was when the military financial people were moved out of this area and down to Tennessee, and I'm hearing that things like the Bureau of Land Management is being moved to Colorado with great weeping and gnashing of teeth among the current bureaucrats in that organization who don't want to move. Any comments about that form of geographic decentralization, which I think is going on and is probably a good idea?
That was part of what I was saving until later, so great. Let's go now.
So it existed during the Federalist era as well. In other words, not only were they taking people from all parts of the country to join the administration, they're also placing them around the country. So the field agents were scattered throughout the country to a much greater extent than they are today. And I think that was done deliberately in order to show people that this new government was present and that it had legitimacy and that it could start forming connections with the people. There's this well-known sort of principle in Federalist number 17 where Hamilton says, a government that is close to the people, that is daily sort of present to them, is going to form the affections of the people towards it. And so I think the Federalists understood that if they wanted the government to gain legitimacy, to be accepted as legitimate by the people, it needed to be there in front of them.
What federal officers would have been distributed other than postmasters, perhaps?
Customs collectors, of course, on the coasts, land surveyors, might be forgetting other...
U.S. attorneys.
Right.
Although they weren't actual employees, they were kind of contract employees, and sometimes state attorneys were used instead. But yeah, it was a very thin civil service at the time, but and most of those were out. For all intents and purposes, it was the customs service that was the most present, at least from the point of view of the relationship between the early.
The only source of federal income. Too.
Exactly. Well, there were until Jefferson, there were some excise taxes and other kinds of things, right? And so the whiskey rebellion, right?
Right.
So so there were tax collectors who got roughed up, but they were present. And if you look at both Hamilton and his work, all of the circular letters, all of the issues, the the communications with those folks, he's constantly communicating with them, making sure that they're following the rules, but also getting feedback from them in which they tell him, you're being a little bit too strict on these rules. You need to give us a little bit more leeway in how we apply these things, and and how we make judgments about collecting customs and and those sorts of things. So it also establishes a kind of early administrative process in terms of field and central office, in terms of that exchange, that also gives intelligence to Hamilton and anybody else in Washington about how the government is having an effect out in the hinterlands.
Okay.
Hi, Aaron Johnson. So on this question of character, I know there are certainly many private professional societies that have ethical components, and you're required to sign and study ethics. So what's the current status, in the federal bureaucracy with respect to ethical components of training or certifications?
Is there a federal ethics code?
Yes.
I mean, I don't mean a law. I mean just the code of ethical conduct.
Generic principles.
So, for example, the the American Society of Public Administration has a code of ethics. So if you're a member of that, you would have pledged yourself to that. But is there an independent code of ethics?
Yes, there are regulations by the Office of Government Ethics that apply government-wide,
Right.
with the exception of the President and Vice President.
Right, but I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about a separate code that says these are the principles to which we dedicate ourselves. And except for your oath of office, is there one? I'm not sure there is.
I'd say criminal statutes are a pretty good substitution for a code. Involuntary society may be bound by a code, but civil servants are subject to criminal penalty. I don't know that criminal penalty should be called less than principles.
No, I wasn't proposing that they were less than, but there's a sort of a kind of an articulation of a more expansive sense of your duties that go beyond what a law or regulation might stipulate.
There's the Trump Ethics Pledge, which replaced the Obama Ethics Pledge, which covers only certain.
Does that apply to merit employees or just to appointees?
Appointees.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is actually,
Oh, great.
there is something in this Code of Federal Regulations called the Basic Obligation of Public Service.
Ah, very interesting.
This, 14 principles of, what is it called? 14 principles, 14 general principles, such as public service is a public trust,
Yeah.
requiring employees to place loyalty to the Constitution, the laws, and ethical principles of a private gain. That's number one. It goes on, 14 of them.
Okay.
I think an interesting follow-on question to whether these things exist, it would be how effective are they in practice? Do people follow them? Do people know about? Do
they
people
know
know
about
about
them?
them?
Right.
Have they read? Do they read these carefully? Because if you really want to get at the question of fitness of character, it's more important than
judge
just
that.
having these
Right.
codes or these rules or laws, right? It's about whether it's sort of part of the ethos of the civil service.
Great. Yeah.
There are requirements for annual training.
In annual training in what?
In these principles and in various ethical requirements, the code, the regulations that have been mentioned. But as a federal employee
Interesting.
for many years, you have to take annual training.
Interesting.
Okay.
Three quick questions. Since you mentioned inheritance of civil service jobs in the 19th century, has there been any studies of how many civil servants in the late 20th and 21st century are the sons and daughters of civil servants? Also, you mentioned exams in the 19th century. Weren't there many exams in the 20th and aren't there still some exams in the 21st century? And third, what's the impact of all the veterans' preferences that have been around since post-World War II?
I'm not aware of any inheritance rights or or de facto right that people are sort of passing jobs down to children, or even just that. But I would get, I don't know of any specific studies about that.
Okay. And the reason I ask this, if you go to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, everyone who's 35 who's a civil servant, either their mother or their father, or more than likely both, were civil servants at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Because the only way to get a civil service job is someone has to know enough to get you through all the application process.
Right.
So it's become the family business.
Okay. Next, do you want to mark anything else? No. Okay. Yeah. Oh, and then okay.
Nothing about exams?
Meaning, do they exist today, or are they pervasive today?
Or were they pervasive in the late 20th century?
I get the sense that they are. They were and still are today.
Foreign service, yeah. For certain things they.
Richard Coleman, I spent 40 years with Customs, Bureau of Customs, became the Customs Service, became CBP. I think it's important to recognize the role of my agency in the urgency of creating the Civil Service Commission, since it was the Collector of Customs in New York, where all this money's coming in, ornate office, and he absconds, goes to Paris. What a shock, what a horror, what a scandal. And he was replaced with another Collector of Customs for New York, who did the exact same thing and ended up in Paris as well. So I guess there was more than a philosophical interest in gaining control of bureaucracy.
I've never known how to pronounce his last name, but the first, at least, of the succession of people who stole a bunch of money from the Treasury and fled to Europe. Samuel, is it Swartwout? Who gave rise to the famous case of Murray's lessee, right, which lawyers in here may know, who ran off with about 5% of the federal budget for 1 year. It was over $1 million, but a pretty large portion of the federal budget at the time. So the New York Customs Office was sort of the prize position, and really a lot of the patronage battles and the corruption really stems from just that one office.
Okay, Andrew.
Hi, Andy Rudalevich. Two quick questions on the geographic distribution question. One is sort of just a trivia question. My memory is that some large percentage of federal workers do live outside the D.C. area now. 80% maybe? Is that a number that sounds right? Yeah, so it's so already, when we talk about dispersing government, that's done in a certain sense. So I actually was asking Joe's last point about presidential management and the use of these kinds of reorganizations and relocations as a form of that. We seem to be seeing that a little bit. The Malek manual, so-called, sort of talked about how to move recalcitrant civil servants out to less desirable geographic postings.
Right.
But we're seeing that, at least in echo form, maybe with shifts in different pieces of the Department of Agriculture, for example. Right. Some of the economic research folks are being moved out to Kansas City and so forth. And obviously there are advantages to presidential management, but personal resistance to that, you could see it as legitimate in terms of the treatment of a professional bureau that is now being asked to uproot itself.
Right.
So I'm just curious as to your view of how that does fit into the last piece of your sequence.
Yeah. So, I think I'm saying today we're in this sort of civil service system of presidential management. I think that's more the case as a matter of public administration theory than it is of actual practice. We have, each one of these new systems gets layered on an existing system. So when you get the rise of presidential management, it doesn't just do away with the progressive notion of neutral competence, which is well established, and we've had decades of practice in which we've built these kinds of regulatory institutions. So you end up getting today, I think, a sort of mixture of a lot of the different principles, because we didn't just get rid of everything that existed when we started down the path of presidential management. So I think, though, the question of presidential management, we sort of take as, I think in some sense, a well-grounded constitutional rule, right? That the president should be responsible for all of the acts of the administration, and that whatever enhances the president's ability to direct, supervise, manage, and control is a good thing. That's why I find the Whig alternative to be so interesting. These were people who really deeply cared about constitutional principle, and yet they came to a very different conclusion about the president's control over the bureaucracy. Their argument was the bureaucracy is an arm of Congress, which also makes sense from the point of view of constitutional theory. Its job is to carry out the will of the legislature. And so when, say, Jackson tells the Treasury Secretary to withdraw the bank deposits, their argument is the president can't do that because the administrators are tools of the law, right? They're instruments of the law, not of the will of the president. So I think sometimes we actually may emphasize presidential management a little too much. There are extremes even in this civil service system that we're in now, which is, I think, why it might be worthwhile to go back and sort of read some of the things they had to say about that.
I think it's interesting, the question of presidential management versus responsiveness to the president. So there's a lot of informal acknowledgement that, if the president wants something, you should respond to that, right? And how you do that then becomes the challenge to administrators, because it's not a matter of formal structural management. It's the president wants to do this or take the policy in this direction. How do you respond to that? Or it's even just a matter of priorities. You're working on something, right? Just to take the EPA, you're working on some regulatory impact analysis, and suddenly the president wants to do something else, and you get reassigned to respond to that short-term presidential thing. And the question is that a good, from the point of view of the civil service, is that a good use of civil service time and energy to suddenly shift over and do something else? And how do you think about that as a question of what your responsibilities and roles are as a civil servant? Should you always just drop what you're doing and respond to a presidential initiative or something like that? Or should you commit yourself, because it's a version of what you were just saying, should you commit yourself to the long-term performance of whatever the law requires and whatever regulatory action required to fulfill the law? And that's a real tension that's existed now since the rise of presidential management, is how far merit civil servants need to be, sensitive and responsive to presidential, I don't want to call them edicts, but preferences, as opposed to continuing to do what the law requires them to do to fulfill their obligations to carry out the law. So it would be interesting, again, to think more about that and what other analogies could be used to help flesh that out from I'm interested in the theory side, but also as a practical matter.
On the back row.
Thank you. My name is James Vidray. I had a question about alternatives to sort of the big five that you've talked about. It seems like most of them are focused on more of a one-size-fits-all to the question of expertise versus presidential management. But then you've got folks like James Wilson, who when they look at the bureaucracy say there's 4 types of agencies, and it really breaks down depending on whether the inputs are objectively observable or really fuzzy, and whether the outputs are observable or fuzzy. And if you have sort of, in at least one typology, agencies where you can have different behavior by the folks there, it would seem that you could also have a theory that at the upper level, in terms of control, you want to have different dials for that balance between expertise and political control, depending on what behavior you expect out of different typologies of agencies. Has that ever been something that has sort of attracted attention and a coherent theory of maybe we should have different dials?
That's a great question.
I think that's really interesting. So the idea, the paper that I'm writing here is really looking at the question of staffing and what is the principle of staffing and how does the constitutional sort of system inform that. Wilson's approach is more to think, about what is the nature of the institution's goal, or is this something like that can be measured very clearly, or is it something that's ill-defined, and therefore you should have different structures to conform to the various missions and the different kinds of missions that an agency might have. I am completely unaware of any attempt in American history to try to merge those two considerations. But I think it's a really interesting suggestion for how we might think about it today.
Yeah, it's a matter of trying to merge public management theory, that is management about the theory about the nature of organizations, with the design of a civil service system that has roots in constitutional principles.
Right.
There's no reason why you couldn't at least try to make it work. It'd be somewhat complicated, but we have a complicated system now, so why should it matter? Yeah, that is really interesting.
Yeah, on the back row.
Donald Elliott. I want to resist the notion, if I understood it correctly, that character does not play an important role today. I think character plays a very important role, but it's not based on family. My knowledge about this is basically limited to the General Counsel's office at EPA, where I once served and have continued to deal with them for many, many years. But the final selection process is largely by existing career staff who look for manifestations of what they consider good character in the activities that people have previously done in their career. And so, for example, if someone has worked for an environmental group or they've worked for a state regulatory agency, these are regarded as the manifestation of a character and commitment that makes it appropriate for them to become part of the career civil service. On the other hand, if they've spent their time working for corporate law firms, that's not necessarily disqualifying, but they certainly have some splaining to do in the interviews.
Okay. Any comments? Sure.
Hi, I'm Jeff Lubbers, and I wanted to raise the senior executive service issue with you. I was a member of the senior executive service when I served at the administrative conference, and it was originally set up to be sort of an elite group of federal employees who would circulate around the government and use their expertise in different areas, but it didn't work out that way. Mostly because once you're in a SES member, you don't want to move, and there's not much incentive for you to want to move, so people don't really move. And another point about the SES is when I remember most presidents, of course, even since Carter, Nixon and Carter and on, have kind of run against Washington. But George H.W. Bush, when he came into office, he held a big meeting at Constitution Hall for SES members, and it was basically a pep rally saying, we really appreciate your service, thank you for everything you do. It was the only time I've ever heard of anything like that. And I just wanted to get your views on the SES.
So my reading or my take on the SES was it was also intended to sort of give the president additional management capacity, right? They would render the bureaucracy more accountable to the president. But there are a lot of other reasons, some of which you suggest, that make them not as accountable to the president as they might seem to be in theory.
90% are career.
Right, yeah, and also I think there's just the question of the environment in which these people work. So this is, again, not so much on the civil service side, although it does implicate these questions, sort of the rise of the personal presidency in terms of management out of the West Wing rather than through the cabinet and through the political appointees in the actual departments. From my sort of reading on that is the presidents realized very quickly that they could be more effective in controlling the bureaucracy through their personal employees and the EOP as opposed to their cabinet secretaries. We normally think, most people think that the cabinet secretaries are the ones that are sort of carrying out the president's mission, and it's really what's going on actually much closer to the West Wing. So that's another reason I think why the SES didn't quite pan out the way people thought it would.
Well, here's a historical counterfactual. Suppose there wasn't a Schedule C. Maybe the SES would have fulfilled the, I mean, it would have had to be designed somewhat differently than it was. But I think, and those of you who know can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a real resistance to the notion of a higher civil service. That is, this elite core that was general managers that would essentially run the administrative state.
Like in France.
Yes, right? And, you know, I mean, there is the Federal Executive Management Institute and things like that, but it's nothing like the notion of a real higher civil service. And I think there's understandable reasons why there would be resistance to it. But again, maybe I'm off base on that. But it just seems to me that even after the passage in 1978 that the Civil Service Reform Act and creating the SES, that there just wasn't the long-term commitment to making it something more than paying people a little more than GS, whatever it is, 18, to, you know, keep them in the civil service.
Paul, did you have?
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Back to that question, James Q. Wilson raised about. It occurs to me maybe our panel will address this, so I wanted to give it sort of an alert. I do think it matters what kind of official you are and what kind of role you play and what agency you're in. I'll just take out administrative judges, which is what we'll be talking about. If you're in the judicial part of the administration, then you have certain different protections, I think, than you might have if you're in other parts. The hard question, which we'll address, is whether political independence matters as well as sort of judicial independence.
No.
I agree.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to ask a question. At the end of the paper, Joe talks about this is a paper that, you know, reformers should look back on and kind of get a sense of history and some things that might be useful to go back and consider. So is there a particular impetus right now for reform, or are there particular reforms that are making their way? And then maybe to Andy, what is the willingness, or perhaps I should ask, what's the ability of Congress to take on civil service reform?
I think the question of whether there's political movement or impetus for reform, I think is probably something that's going to continue to come up throughout the day, maybe even the next panel. I don't know how significant the impetus is, but I at least know there are people thinking about it and who are concerned about that, you know, this is a system in need of reform. Again, I don't know how serious the political momentum is, but it does seem like these civil service reform seems to come up every so often. Mm-hmm. It's the joke is the party systems, right? There's a periodicity to the realignments, and I guess my paper suggests there is a sort of periodicity to the civil service reform movements, that they do tend to come up every generation or so. But that's the most I can say about whether there's real political momentum.
Okay, Andy?
Well, I would say, again, obviously it depends a lot what sort of civil service reform we'd be talking about. But if one of the key questions is, you could say, accountability or responsiveness, I think under current conditions, there's not much prospect, because basically no matter who's in power, whoever the president is, the other party is not interested in greater responsiveness of the bureaucracy to the president. And I think unless we can get out of that kind of partisan environment into either an issue that doesn't have those sorts of implications, or a political situation in which one side has overwhelming majorities, then I don't see much prospect for anything on the issues of accountability or responsiveness.
Okay.
I would just build on Andy's earlier point about the Pendleton Act, which is, it probably happened when it did because it was a problem that Congress needed to be solved. because they were now in a situation that was untenable. Even though it was a slow transition, right? Only 11, 12% get covered initially. They needed to get themselves out of a pickle. And I would guess that a similar thing's going to happen. If you're really going to get substantial civil service reform, it's going to happen when Congress has a problem that it sees it needs to solve, and then that's part of the solution to whatever their problem is. I can't imagine what that might be, but otherwise it'll just be tinkering.
Okay. Really quick question.
Yeah, so it seemed to me, speaking of Congress's role, that if Congress were ever really to get, approach it this way, the part of Congress that seems most like the expert bureaucracy to me in the executive branch is the committee staffs, right? That's where you have expertise. So if Congress ever, for any reason, wanted to get religion on non-delegation, it might strike it that the easiest way to do that is not to eliminate or even significantly downsize the bureaucracy, but to recruit it. Switch it from working to the executive and making decisions to giving advice to members of Congress, where under bicameral presentment, the advice would have to be filtered through the actual member, but they would still have a lot of policy making to do. Any reflections?
It strikes me that there's been a development in Congress that has weakened committees and therefore committee staff to the extent that that would be an obstacle in the way of what you're envisioning, right? That the recruitment of bureaucrats into the staff on the committees, you'd have to entice them by saying that they can actually do something. And increasingly, congressional committees are doing less and less because of the different dynamics in Congress that have developed over the last 20 or 30 years. But in theory, had that development not occurred, I think there'd be a lot of wisdom in what you're suggesting.
Well, I think the point he's making too is that if I don't think that Congress is going to voluntarily take up the non-delegation because they have too much to gain from delegation, right? Which is why it's happened to begin with. But if the courts were to say we're going back to non-delegation, Congress would, in that case, perhaps be pushed into something like that.
Or they'd find a way around it.
Yeah.
That is a frequent theme of these conferences, Andy. And a good note to end on. Okay, so I wanted to thank our panel. I especially want to thank Dr. Bush for coming out when he's just recovering from a cold. I really appreciate the effort to be here. So thank you.